Recently, The Atlantic ran a piece entitled, "No, Women Aren't the Problem. America is rapidly becoming the manosphere. But sure, let's go after the feminization of the culture." Well, as it happens, it is kind of past time we went after that very thing. Women dominate cultural narratives. As I'll demonstrate, they overwhelmingly write, edit, storyboard, gatekeep, curate, and distribute cultural meaning across social media, music, literature, pop culture journalism, lifestyle media, relationship discourse, advertising, TV writers' rooms, and nearly every other high bandwidth domain. This isn't great because it skews representation and reflection of culture and society. Just as importantly, as I'll also explain, it has made culture a little boring.
I'm disappointed in your species.
Women shape the imagery we see, not the budgets, not the approvals, but the cultural signal itself. If you strip the ad industry down to how actual cultural representation is crafted, who appears, what emotional register the audience is guided into, what social cues get signaled, then the answer is mostly women. Not in the boardrooms, but in the hands-on day-to-day creative labor that actually produces the image layer of society, where storyboards are conceived, emotional arcs are chosen, characters are shaped, tone of voice is written, and social norms are implied. Those roles are overwhelmingly female in 2025. Copywriters, 55% women, content creatives and social writers, 55 to 65% women, and digital native content creators, 60% women. These are the people who literally write the norms, how men and women behave, how gender is coded, who is sympathetic, who is aspirational, what masculinity and femininity look like in a narrative. Who casts the people we see? Casting directors are 70 to 75% women. The casting director decides which bodies are acceptable, which male physiques are aspirational, which female performances signal relatability, authenticity, empowerment, which faces and mannerisms embody mainstream identity. Who shapes the visual language? Art directors, 55% women, designers and content visualists, 60% women, and social-first creative producers, 70% women. The producer chooses director options, casting shortlist, stylistic priorities, what is emphasized or cut, what the client sees. So, who actually makes the normative imagery of society? Not the agency CEO. The cultural output comes from the creative middle layer, the writers, art directors, casting directors, creative producers, and digital-led creatives, who are predominantly women, under 40, progressively educated, highly online. Why this is negative? An increasing number of guys I know experience something I'm going to term NCD, or non-customized content disorientation. This is when a guy who was used to his feed delivering content with relatable male figures, discussing and reflecting relatable male content and proclivities, switches over to something mainstream, like terrestrial TV or generic entertainment, and is suddenly confronted with men in advertising who are confoundingly chubby, or gluttonous, or sexless, or goofy, or histrionic, or just benign caricatures, which seems to be the house style of modern advertising.
This is really gay.
Yeah, it is.
They are often displaced from the narrative center, are the subject of fondly disparaging looks and gentle scolding, and have a kind of heavily prescribed and highly ironized masculinity. It's grating and feels not only reductionist, but actually quite dated. The writer's room. At major studios like Disney, Paramount, Amazon, etc., which gender is dominating in the writer's room, where socio-cultural messaging, casting, narrative shaping, self-inserts, and even ideology are at play? The writer's rooms, the actual engines of narrative, character behavior, socio-cultural messaging, and identity portrayal, have, over the last decade, shifted decisively toward women, especially in TV streaming. Not executives, not corporate boards, but the place where the culture is actually written. The current baseline across Hollywood TV writers' rooms shows women in streaming series, 50 to 55%, women in YA, animation, genre TV, and prestige dramedies, 55 to 70%, and women in drama writers' rooms, 50 to 60%. Certain categories, the ones most associated with cultural messaging, commentary on gender, identity, social norms, and generational values, are heavily female-led and female-staffed. YA, teen, coming of age, 60 to 75% women. Animation, 55 to 70% women. These are the rooms responsible for identity-driven storylines, the more overt ideological messaging, the TikTok Zoomer-coded emotional tones, the therapy speak style of character dialogue, the deconstruction, reconstruction of masculinity, female-centric empowerment arcs, non-binary and queer representation, and social justice-aligned narrative cues. Disney's internal story groups for both animation and live action have been majority women for years. Pixar flipped from 80% male story teams to 50-60% female story artists in the last decade. TV is culturally dominant, and TV writers' rooms are now female-led. Film remains symbolic, but TV streaming drives cultural norms. Daily visibility, hundreds of hours of character exposure, bingeable moral frameworks, episodic identity formation, relatable modern behavior templates. This means the ideological, behavioral, and psychological coding of contemporary TV storytelling is now predominantly women-created. So, even though men still dominate certain high-profile film genres, the overwhelming majority of the cultural messaging consumed by Western audiences, especially the narrative frameworks absorbed subconsciously, comes from female majority writers' rooms. This doesn't matter so much when it comes to new content. The market can decide on the fate of that. The issue has been the frustrating notion that intrinsically boy brands that girls could also enjoy should be adapted into being franchises and properties that are supposedly universal or even female-led, with Kathleen Kennedy overseeing a ridiculously overpowered Mary Sue girl boss who can wield the Force almost like a demigod and is morally flawless. A female showrunner fighting fiercely to keep a line in James Bond where a queer villain caresses him and Bond says, "You think this isn't my first time?" Or Lord of the Rings, where Galadriel is reimagined as a prickly, ridiculously overpowered, morally superior force of nature who recurrently puts men in their place for sport. Or Star Trek, which at its best could be intellectual, elegiac, and redolent with themes. Now a Gen Z show full of feels and vibes, where the predator is reduced to a kind of lamentable dweeb version of the species, and Aliens, where the men are oddly effete or conniving or emotionally vapid, easily flustered, and scrawny. The lack of compelling or even interesting masculinity in this whole range of familiar intellectual properties has gotten to the point where it's hard to even care much anymore. Publishing. Of literary agents by gender in the US, 78% are women. Query wish lists and deal flow lean into upmarket book club fiction, romantasy, contemporary relationship-led stories, YA, and character-driven literary work. All categories where recent rooms, readership, and sales are strong for women authors. Analyses of agent profiles and wish lists for 2025 likewise show concentration in those categories. This doesn't exclude male or non-female authors in literary fiction, but the path of least resistance, from slush pile to representation to sale, currently runs through categories with robust female readership, female majority authorship, and abundant agent expertise enthusiasm. Why this is negative? The whole culture laments the drop-off in men reading. But there is one aspect of it that media discourse and the literary world would find psychologically impermissible to think about. That a female-dominated world of literature might be kind of boring. There is no modern literary zeitgeist. There are no exciting literary circles or symposiums, no bohemian or mercurial public intellectual authors or author rivalries, no novels that cause a sensation in the wider culture, no novels that dazzle by being provocative, and outside of literary circles, most people aren't able to name more than a couple of modern authors, let alone any that have blazed a trail as icons, luminaries, game changers, or whose work is essential reading that causes ructions and debates. Almost the entire discourse bemoans men's reading habits and leaves out this other element. Men are zeitgeist-driven. If there are novels that capture or ignite the zeitgeist, blending the high literary with the gothic violent, or the technological, or the compelling anti-hero, or junky intellectual, then they'll tune in. But right now, while there's an immense amount of good writing, there's a prevailing sense that nothing much is happening. Music. Across 2025 so far, the gender balance of artists appearing on the Billboard Hot 100 looks like this. Male artists, 65 to 70%. Female, 28 to 32. However, men dominate chart presence, but women dominate impact. On total streams, men still lead, because genres like hip-hop and trap, heavily male-dominated, produce massive volume. But on cultural salience per artist, women now dominate the global top 10 streaming artists more consistently, dominate viral hits, dominate TikTok-driven discovery, the new engine of hitmaking, dominate pop's global exports. 65% of the top viral songs have female primary artists or female-led performances. With Spotify's global viral 50 patterns, female artists often account for 50 to 60% of tracks in the top viral slice. Women dominate the highest earning, highest attendance tours. Female artists vastly outperform male artists in social media following, visual influence, consumer brand deals, and parasocial intensity metrics. In 2024, female artists generated 3 to 6 times the cultural social media share of voice. This is the part people misunderstand, or the likes of Slate and the Daily Beast aren't willing or able to dig enough down into to get a balanced perspective. Men dominate the quantity of artists and chart entries, but women dominate the high-intensity cultural space. Biggest songs, biggest tours, biggest albums, highest replay value, highest social permeation power, and most crossover media footprints. Men flood the charts, women define the era. This is why, despite a 70 to 30 male-female split in total artists, the 2020s feel to you probably like a female-led cultural decade in music. Why this is negative? In my view, a key element of being a musical icon is that you have to appeal to cool people of both genders. Aretha Franklin was a cool, luminary figure to men and women. Bob Dylan was the cynosure of hip to young men and women. Same with David Bowie. There is not a single cool young guy anywhere in the world who has a poster of Taylor Swift on his wall. End of story. A female-dominated musical culture feels insipid, and for all the emotional and sexual and identity foregrounding, even to the point of being explicit, the musical culture itself feels strangely inert. Pop culture outlets. When it comes to the most visible, highest traffic, narrative-shaping digital sites across culture, commentary, lifestyle, and opinion verticals, writers and contributors, 60 to 70% women. Culture editors, entertainment editors, 65 to 75% women. Opinion editors online, 55 to 65% women, with many outlets having women as the decisive gatekeepers for cultural framing. This is consistent with the known demographic of journalism schools where 70% of graduates are women. Why this matters: the bandwidth of influence. Even though some prestige sites may have balanced mastheads, the actual narrative and cultural framing consumed by the public is being produced by women writers, in the majority, women primary editors, women vertical leads. These are the people who decide which cultural narratives get amplified, what ideological frames are applied to current events, how masculinity and femininity are coded, which political angles are naturalized, which entertainment products are valorized or condemned, and which identity-related frames become normative. Why this is negative? The popular culture discourse isn't all that interesting. Often it can be quite disingenuous in going to bat for shows or remakes that aren't connecting with the public. And as we've seen with what used to be the venerable Old Atlantic, they can publish articles that miss the point about the feminization of the culture to the extent that a YouTuber like me has to weigh in and try and set things to rights a little bit. Fashion, beauty, and aesthetics. 80 to 90% women. This sector has an enormous downstream effect on body politics, masculinity, femininity templates, youth subculture aesthetics, social media culture, the biggest norm setter of the 2020s. Here, gender dynamics matter enormously. TikTok creators, high bandwidth cultural shapers, are 60 to 70% women. Academia. Humanities, social sciences undergraduates are now 60 to 70% women. Grad students in cultural identity-related fields, overwhelmingly women. Gender representation in academia directly shapes identity politics, sociological worldviews, generational moral reasoning. Another perspective that seems psychologically impermissible in the media discourse is that rather than bemoaning the drop-off of young men in the humanities as lost opportunities for young men, or of young men missing out, young men may increasingly be looking at the contemporary humanities and asking, why would I want to be part of that? Publishing gateways. Bookstagram, BookTok, BookTube. These platforms determine which books break out. BookTok, 80 to 90% female creators. Bookstagram, 85% women, and BookTube, 65% women. Video game narratives and fandom culture. Still male-dominated overall, but critical analytical games journalism is 50 to 60% women. Outlets like Polygon, Kotaku, Eurogamer, their culture desks skew female. Narrative meaning in gaming communities often comes from commentary, and commentary is increasingly female. Mental health, therapy, wellness sectors. Therapists, coaches, wellness influencers, trauma educators, self-help writers, 80% plus women. These fields produce the therapeutic vocabulary of culture, the soft emotional norms of Gen Z and late millennials, the moral tone of interpersonal behavior online. So, executives sign off and audiences sign on. The in-between is where norms get built. Feminism, in an outdated kind of model, has always been looking at the C-suite and the CEO level as indicative of where societal and cultural progress should be. But this model doesn't work anymore because it leaves out the important middle. The in-between is where norms get built. Track the bylines, the shot lists, the mood boards, and you'll see who's driving the culture. The editorial board of The Atlantic may not like this exposure of the cultural inner workings, but it's reality.